Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to another live stream. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. This is the second in less than 24 hours. So please do be kind and generous and hit the like button to boost the stream in YouTube's algorithm. Welcome to all Rumble family, all the moderators. It's great to be here. We have a really good show for you today as we mark the closing in on the third year of the Ukraine conflict, in which we continue to see Russia advancing along the front lines, crushing Ukraine's army, causing a crisis of morale and desertion, which has been made worse now with Trump's promise to end the war. JD Vance is in Germany at Munich, bludgeoning Europe, urging the continent to take care of its own matters and return to shared values with the United States, as Trump mulls troop withdrawal from Europe as rumored by German media. Now, we are going to talk about all of this and more with a special guest, which is Mark Sleboda. He's an international affairs and security analyst and a friend of the show. Mark, good to be back with you.
Danny, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
Of course. It's great to be back with you, Mark. Well, where do we even begin? We have, of course, the Putin-Trump talks, which have shaken Europe most of all. We also have now the Munich Security Conference underway. JD Vance gave a speech absolutely tearing into Europe itself. Europe has been a big target of the Trump administration in this move toward closing in on a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. But of course, it is very, very early, Mark. And I want your take on this because we have a situation, I believe, where a lot of talk is happening and likely to happen on the Trump side in particular. But I'm curious about your assessment of the situation right now. I've heard you say the battlefield is really what's going to dictate terms here. And so that isn't being spoken about as much. Talk about what's going on with regard to this conflict now that we have all kinds of hype about the U.S. and Russia engaging in negotiations.
Sure. First, if I may digress, to all the women out there or men, if you swing that way, happy Valentine's Day. At the time of recording, if you are watching this streaming live, then you are not married, then you are yes, you're losers. Yay. Celebrate monogamy or solitary relationship anyway. I've already gifted my wife, so I'm excused and allowed to do the podcast this evening. So yeah, I mean, we have had so much happening diplomatically. I mean, in Ukraine, elsewhere in the world, politically in the United States, Trump is waging an obviously prepared shock war on the deep state in the United States, which is, they obviously have momentum on their side and purpose, and they're just, deep state, the blob, the permanent bureaucracy, whatever you want to call it, right? We all know what we're talking about, and U.S. aid is just the tip of the iceberg there. So, plus we have Trump threatening to ethnically cleanse Gaza and turn it into some type of real estate deal. I mean, we're all over the place. It is the Trump chaos bomb. It is like a bouncing Betsy grenade. It's just spinning around, going off here, going off there, going off everywhere. And the whole rest of the world is trying to recover and catch up and figure out where Trump's, where he's serious and where he's not. And it's exhausting. It's exhilarating in a way. I don't necessarily mean that in a good way, because things are all over the place, and maybe in some particular locations and for some particular subjects it may be good in one place and bad in another place, and it's going to be 4 years, presumably. But certainly one of the most momentous is that finally, after 3 years of silence and no diplomacy whatsoever, the US president and the Russian president have spoken by phone. And the way they presented this, I know there's a lot of rumors and talks, and there have been rumors, in the Washington Post going back to the autumn that Trump and Putin have spoken before. I don't think so. I think the way this conversation was presented, it seems to indicate to me the big deal that certainly that Trump made out of it. He seems unable to contain himself with his posts on social media, that this was the first direct conversation that they have had. We also know, though, that obviously at a lower level, the United States and Russia were already communicating, certainly on an intelligence level, as we saw by the prisoner exchange that preceded preceded just by a day the conversation between Trump and Putin, where the U.S. got Mark Fogel back in American, a English teacher, supposedly, in Russia, who was supposedly caught with marijuana, which I know in some parts of the U.S. it's not a crime, but it is here. And the Russian cryptocurrency and so we say computer expert, hacker, whatever terminology you want to use, Alexander Vinnik, he was one of these that the U.S. hunts down. He was actually arrested in Greece, and then he was extradited to France, and then the U.S. nabbed him because it has been their modus operandi for several years to try to extend U.S. justice into other countries to try to grab as many Russians up as they can, presumably for exchanges just like this. Right? Can't really see any other reason why they would go to such an extent for this. Now, there's rumors that both sides had both of these individuals may or may not have worked with their respective intelligence as assets or so forth, but it's not so important. Anyway, the American side was made a circus out of the whole affair and decked him out with an American flag around his neck and a glass of beer in his hand, and with photo ops with Trump. Well, the Russian side said, kind of with a bit of disdain and contempt, that when the Russian prisoner who was released by the United States hadn't been announced yet, they said the comment from Lavrov was, "We will respect the agreed upon confidentiality agreements." That's the way we'll do this, right? I.e., we're not going to make a media circus out of this. We had agreed with the Americans to keep it on the lowdown, but they're doing their thing, and we'll do our thing. So it was, with a bit less fanfare that Vinnik was returned to Russia, although, it was certainly glad to get any Russian citizen back, whether he faces charges here or not. That's irrespective. So that led, obviously that set a level of cooperation, right? A goodwill gesture, if you will, that went right into the conversation between Trump and Putin. And both before that and during that, and now after that, we have heard so many contradictory things coming out of the Trump administration with regard to Ukraine. Some of them positive, some of them negative, some of them just data points all over the place. And it makes it really hard to chart a coherent trajectory of events with regard to negotiations that, at least on the U.S. side, are intended to bring this conflict to a close on terms that are closer to the United States. Russia's eager to talk, but maybe not so eager for this conflict to end, certainly not on American terms. Let's keep one thing in mind. The U.S., Trump is now the U.S. president, right? Which means that he owns this war. He owns this conflict, right? I know they're trying to play some neutral third-party arbiter that will knock the heads of Russia and Ukraine involved in this quote-unquote ridiculous war together, and he'll make a deal and make them see sense and bring them to peace because of all the beautiful people that are dying, right? This type of rhetoric. And the Russians are like, yeah, okay, you're the U.S. president and you are a party to this conflict. What's more, you are on the losing side of this conflict. You don't make a plan and dictate terms to us. We dictate terms to you. That's the way this is going to go. They're smiling. They're glad for dialogue, right? Putin has been from the beginning. We're happy to sit down and talk, but then if you want to get serious about ending this conflict, then we're going to get serious. But we're not going to sacrifice things. We are not going to make concessions so that you can save political face as the U.S. president. That's not what is going to happen here. So I think with some of the statements that have come out of Trump during or in the immediate aftermath of the phone call between Putin and Trump, I think there's some just craziness. There is people maybe overreacting to this in some ways, and on the pro-Western, pro-Kiev regime side, the media is calling this, like the end of the world. There was a wonderful piece. I'm being facetious, but I believe it was in the Telegraph by a longtime anti-Russian writer with the unlikely name of Roland Oliphant. No idea whether that's a real name, but he's been around forever, and he's standard vitriolic, rabid anti-Russian. And what he the headline that he put up and the article that he put up was basically it's Trump's and Putin's world. And he was lamenting the fact that the the European Union and the Kiev regime were apparently just being left in the dust and ignored. Yeah, there it is. This is a wonderful little piece that sums up the horror, how aghast the Western, certainly the European political elite, and the U.S. blob with the that is still, of course, largely, I mean, pretty much entirely, the holdover from the Biden regime that will take a long time for Trump to clear out, to purge, and so forth. But they're aghast, they're in horror, they're in shock and surprise, and everything is rolling now and happening so fast, both inside the United States and now suddenly with this. And it's amazing that it all comes like right as Tulsi Gabbard and RFK were confirmed. Like, we're in the clear now, and off to the races. So that's interesting, and it is very heartening to me to see Tulsi Gabbard as the director of national intelligence, and that she will. It is a surprise. I did not expect her to get through, and I think it definitely indicates that Trump has a stronger control of the Republican Party and the Republican Party elite than and many others, I think, too, had assumed that he does. So that's interesting in itself. But the sheer fact that every time the U.S. National Security Council meets, when neocons like Rubio and Waltz are whispering in Trump's ear, Tulsi Gabbard will be at the other end of the table going, hey, arguing back and everything. And I certainly do not agree with everything that Tulsi Gabbard believes, particularly with, let's say the Middle East and some other places. But by and large, I mean, she seems very principled, even if you don't agree with all of those principles. And she seems committed to ending the politicization and weaponization of intelligence, considering that she herself was listed on a politicized terror watch list by the intelligence agencies that she is now nominally in charge of as the DNI is endlessly amusing. So the Western political elite, the leaders in Europe, the blob in the United States, everyone is still reeling from what is happening and hasn't formed a coherent response or fight back yet. But it is beginning, and we're going to see a lot of hysteria in the Western media in the coming week. And there's been, I think, a bit of, shall we say, premature elation from some people in the alt media and the pro-Russian side as well, perhaps putting too much weight on developments, specifically with regards to the negotiations in Ukraine and the course of the conflict there. Let's be clear, it is a huge deal, and it is good. It is an unquantified good that the U.S. president and the Russian president are speaking again, right? That diplomacy is once again being conducted, because the previous administration had obviously the view shared by the U.S. and European political elite that diplomacy is a gift that they grant countries that toe their line, and anyone who is seen as an adversary, they don't get diplomacy. Right. I mean, that it completely changes the whole nature and purpose of diplomacy. But I believe it has to do with this ideology of not just American, but Western exceptionalism, where we believe that we are so morally and societally and structurally superior to you that we won't even deign to soil ourselves by talking to you, because that alone would be a concession, a compromise. And it's just, that led us to the point where we were literally on the brink of World War III, with the Biden administration firing ballistic missiles into Russia, arguably a more dangerous moment than the Cuban Missile Crisis. Although a lot of people didn't take it, I think, as seriously as they should have. But we've pulled back from that brink now, and the Russian and American side, even if they can't come to any agreement on Ukraine, are talking together about not just Ukraine but other things in the world as well. In fact, if you read the long rundown on both sides about what they talked about, right? World War II, right? The sacrifices that both countries made, artificial intelligence, Ukraine, of course, the Middle East, energy, the U.S. currency, the dollar, all of these things. It's like you're reading down that list, and you're actually surprised that they didn't also talk about the Super Bowl and how the Chiefs obviously should have won, and that which country has the superior beer or whatever they happen to be drinking, because it felt like that kind of. It was certainly presented in the Trump's social media post as if it was a lengthy and friendly conversation, which of course drives again the Europeans and the blob up the wall. So this has been accompanied by Pete Hegseth's, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Hegseth's appearance at the Munich Security Conference in Germany, a yearly event. And it's very interesting because if you can actually, I believe, chart the beginning of all of this, perhaps back to 2007, when Putin gave this tremendous speech at the Munich Security Conference and warned essentially the West of the hegemonic, the pursuit of hegemony that they were engaged in, and how it would inevitably lead to a security crisis way back in 2007. I think it's still Putin's seminal speech, right? It if you go back and you can see the chart forward right up to exactly where we are now. And of course he was, they poured feces on him for giving that speech back then and ever since. But it's, I think, quite prescient that he could see back then where this would all go. But Hegseth said some interesting and important things. One, he made the claim that he did not consider it a probable or realistic outcome of negotiations to settle the Ukrainian conflict that Ukraine would be would enter NATO, right? Which is a comment that is being blown all out of proportion by too many people as meaning too much. Now, that again, on both sides, because the Europeans, the Western media, the blob, they immediately jumped on this as a concession. Everyone knows that it's not, Ukraine is not actually going to join NATO anytime soon, right? Everyone knows that. That's not even a question. What Russia wants actually in settlements is some type of codified agreement by the United States, by NATO, that Ukraine will not join NATO, right? Ever. And more importantly, I think even then there's also no de facto NATO, right? No US and NATO keep arming Ukraine and keep training Ukraine, and the West doesn't establish bases or put missiles in Ukraine, right? That is left out of any type of Western discussion. They don't even consider that, right? Which tells you how far apart the two sides still are, right? I mean, Russia is winning on the battlefield, but the West still doesn't acknowledge that they have lost, right? And until they're willing to agree to those things, inevitably the fight will go on. And it bears saying that in the last 24 hours since then, for those of you who have been too drunk and are now hungover on elation of that announcement and moment, Keith Kellogg, the retired general, has popped out of seemingly nowhere to appear and say that NATO admission for Ukraine is not off the table, right? Walking back what the Secretary of Defense said. So I figure that the Secretary of Defense probably ranks higher than Kellogg, and in who we should consider credible, but also consider that Hegseth's comments were really qualified, right? they first of all, it was realistic, and then it was specifically in the context of these negotiations to end the conflict. And two people are running too far with this. I think there's too much celebration of it and not enough. Well, forgive me for touting my own trademarks, but not enough cynicism and skepticism of these rhetorical statements and where this will go. We also had J.D. Vance in front of Munich, on one hand saying that the U.S. wanted to, effectively saying that the U.S. wanted to get out of the Ukraine conflict, right? Some people are arguing the end of Project Ukraine, although certainly Vance didn't use those words. And that he made clear that the U.S. Trump wants to pull U.S. troops out of Europe. Europe should defend themselves, right? And that's also that the U.S. can go to war with China in the Pacific, right? Where obviously Trump is really concerned with, which again is, I mean, maybe temporarily better for Russia, but not so good for the world in the whole multipolar scope of things necessarily. And he has condemned Europe for their security priorities. In fact, he said the biggest threat to Europe is not Russia, is not China, but is their own giving up, their own divestment of their own values. And by that, I assume he was talking mostly, maybe culturally, maybe the social, the woke stuff. But I think he was also very specifically talking about this actions in Romania, perhaps most egregious, but also you could make arguments in France and in Germany to prevent conservative / right-wing, alt-right, far-right, however you want to call it, but heretical political figures from being elected or from coming to power when they do well in elections. And he specifically talked about Romania and Gorgescu and the Romanian Supreme Court just annulling election results on completely bullshit, ridiculous and pretexts that don't hold any water whatsoever. The Europeans, either the European elite, the technocracy, they celebrated this. They cheered it. They approved it. And Vance specifically spoke about that, which, I mean, that, these are very good points. But Vance also dropped another bomb that far too people are not paying enough attention to. Vance also said that if Russia does not negotiate in good faith, quote unquote, i.e., accept the U.S. terms as dictated, then U.S. troops could end up in Ukraine, and the U.S. could level new sanctions on Russia, right? And the sanctions thing, I mean, Russia's like, yeah, yawn, okay, right, yeah, blah, 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 blah. Wait, did you say put troops in Ukraine? And the immediate response from the Kremlin was, we haven't heard that. You want to clarify what you mean by that? I mean, do you want to stand by that? I mean, that was their immediate response. They want clarification of what the U.S. vice president just said at Munich. And you can argue that he's just, I don't know, playing to the Munich crowd, something that he clearly wasn't doing with anything else he was saying there, that this is bluff and bluster. But, all of these things have to be taken in context, right? If you're going to jump to premature elation, that oh, this is the end, Project Ukraine is over, maybe you should also, you're picking and choosing what they're saying at this point and giving credit to some things and saying, oh, when they say that, they don't really mean it. And that is itself is a very dangerous position.
Mark, can I pull up can I pull up actually the Wall Street Journal article,
Yeah.
because it's the interview that you're referencing, because I've seen a lot of people say, oh, the Wall Street Journal, the mainstream media is twisting what he said. Well, let's look at it, because
Yeah.
this is the interview here. Vance wields threat of sanctions military action to push Putin into Ukraine deal. Now, here is what he says. He says there are economic tools of leverage. There are, of course, military tools of leverage. There's a whole host of things we could do. But fundamentally, I think the president wants to have productive negotiation both with Putin and Zelensky. Some are saying, well, Vance isn't saying they're going to do that. But how I see it, Mark, is how you see it, which is it's on the table. He's mentioning that there are military tools, including sending troops to Ukraine as
Yeah,
a point of
I
leverage.
believe that he actually followed up on that and was more specific. I think he actually mentioned U.S. troops in Ukraine. I could be wrong on that, but I think it was more than that. Yeah, it's certainly raising a lot of eyebrows in Russia, and that they're very, very concerned by it, as they should be, right? Because here again, the U.S. if this is the way they're going about this, that they are presenting terms, a carrot and a stick, rather than themselves, shall we say, going into negotiations in good faith, then this is almost certainly not going to end well, right? Or come to any satisfactory conclusion, because Russia is simply not going to respond. I mean, well, they will respond, but they won't ever concede to those points. They are not going just to accept U.S. terms because, well, they won't get any better from Kamala Harris. I mean, that's not an argument, right? They're not going to accept a bad deal after probably 100,000 or more Russian dead, right? That is. There's been too much sacrifice. There's been too much done. Russia has been very clear about what their terms are for a settlement of this conflict, for a ceasefire, for a settlement of the conflict, right? The four regions: Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donbass, Donetsk and Lugansk, plus Crimea and Sevastopol, of course, but also no NATO, no de facto NATO, no EU, no European troops on the ground wearing EU hats instead of NATO hats as quote unquote peacekeepers, no bases, no training, no arms, no the demilitarization, which they can perhaps compromise a bit on what the end size of the Ukrainian military will allow to be at the end of this conflict. The exact terms of denazification or debanderization, that can be discussed. I don't believe actually that the protection of the language, the cultural, the political rights of East Ukrainians, right? You want to say the Russian speakers or the Russian ethnics, is far more than that, right? Of East Ukrainians, right? They will not compromise on that. So there's just such a gulf between the rhetoric and what the West is talking and what Russia's terms and demands are. And it's still a refusal to even recognize in so many words that Russia is winning this conflict. I mean, you still haven't heard that, right? I mean, you heard it in the media, but no political figure says that. No, Vance hasn't said that. Rubio hasn't said that. Trump hasn't said that. Kellogg hasn't said that. And ultimately, maybe that's what it will take. Maybe it will take a true strategic defeat of the U.S., of NATO in this situation. They will have to be humiliated. right? Maybe that's what it will take. They will have to be humiliated, and it will be unable to deny. If you'll remember the way that the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, right? What most of the world knew for decades was that the Soviet Union gave up and pulled their missiles out of Cuba. But what they don't know is there was actually, on both sides, the Soviet Union had only put nuclear missiles in Cuba because the US put missiles in Turkey and in Europe. And those missiles were also removed as a result of this, which means you could argue that the Soviet Union won this crisis confrontation because they only put missiles in Cuba as a response to the U.S. putting missiles in Turkey and in Europe. But part of the agreement was from the Kennedy government is, but you have to help us save face because we can't be seen as losing, right? Because it's all about the narrative. It's all about the appearance. And so the Soviet Union quietly agreed to that and agreed to never talk about. Even a lot of people in the Soviet Union, a lot of politicians in the Soviet Union didn't know of the end result of that negotiation and how the U.S. missiles were pulled out of Turkey and Europe in response to it, all to save the U.S. face. I don't think Putin is in a mood. I don't think anyone in the Kremlin is in a mood to help Donald Trump save face with the terms of this agreement. There's been too much sacrificed. So while there are lots of good signs, there are also bad signs, and we don't have enough coherent trajectory yet to dismiss some of them and accept others. Meanwhile, Russia just continues on the battlefield. They have made clear there will be no ceasefire, right? There was Minsk 1, there was Minsk 2, there was the Istanbul communique. They've been played for suckers enough times, and they're not going to fall for it and give a chance for the Kiev regime to be armed and mobilize 18-year-olds or whatever again. So they will continue, and these negotiations could be dragged out over a very long period of time, particularly if there is an agreement. Obviously, Zelensky's not going to agree to this, but that there needs to be elections in Ukraine. An agreement that Zelensky is not the legitimate because he's only extending his powers, acting powers of president because his term is expired, and it's only because of repeated martial law declarations, one after the other, that he's keeping his powers, right? Which is, when Russia continually brings this up, it is indeed a valid point for the legitimacy, into the future of any documents that are signed. But it is also, of course, Russia attempting to poke and destabilize the Kiev regime, right? It's both at the same time, and it can be both. But we've heard both Kellogg and Trump mention elections in Ukraine. Now, how has Zelensky responded by this? By immediately going after any potential political opponents, right? Yermak immediately went and talked to Zaluzhny, where he's supposedly a diplomat in the UK. Poroshenko, the Candy oligarch, the former leader of the Kiev regime, the first one that was roundly defeated in quote elections in Ukraine. He is the leader of the so-called European Solidarity Party, right? Which is just another Banderite Maidan party. And just different personalities. When Zelensky came into office, he did absolutely everything that Poroshenko did, just continued right along the line, perhaps even worse, arguably more nationalist on some things. But it's there's not any ideological or political differences between the two men. It's all about egos and power and me and my clan versus you and your clan and that. There's no real difference between the two. But he has previously already been charged. Zelensky charged the leader of pretty much every major opposition party in the country with treason. Right, he declared them all to be traitors, and that extended even to the Maidan party. Right, the one of the Maidan parties, the other party that he defeated, the European Solidarity Party of the Kiev regime. And Poroshenko, those charges are now being actively pursued against him again, and they're trying to arrest him and bring him in and to prevent any opposition from coalescing around him in two different regards. One, not giving the West anyone else they can back if they say there must be elections in Ukraine, right? And two, because Trump is quite obviously removing the shield of protection from around Zelensky, there is, of course, the possibility that people who have been considering holding some type of coup or other extra, electoral process means of removing Zelensky. Be it Poroshenko, Timoshenko, Zaluzhny, I don't know, anyone. But they haven't obviously acted up till now, because as long as the U.S. had their shield of protection, they were backing Zelensky. No one could make a move against him. Right? That it just would never be accepted by the U.S. But now, right, that shield of protection is off. So he's immediately, for both of those reasons, potential elections and the threat of a coup, going after any potential political opponents. And it has to be said that there have not been any type of free, fair, legitimate elections in Ukraine since the West-backed Maidan Putsch in 2014. All of the real opposition parties in the country, certainly all the political parties representing the people of East Ukraine, all the leftist parties in the country have been lustrated, pogromed, and all ultimately banned, right? All critical media has been silenced. It was silenced actually all the media of East Ukraine was silenced well before Russia's intervention in 2022. All the leaders of the opposition parties have been declared treasonous because they're not loyal to the regime. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been undergoing a pogrom because it's viewed as not being 100% politically loyal to the regime, whatever they may say, to the contrary. The idea that Zelensky is illegitimate because his term expired always rubs me a little wrong. He was always illegitimate. Like the entire process since 2014 has been illegitimate and undemocratic. But, I understand why they're pushing this point home, supposedly according to the rules that the Maidan regime is even playing by. So anyway, if there is elections to be held in Ukraine, that was a process that will take months, right? It's not going to happen overnight. And while that process is undergoing, Russia has said, we're not giving you a ceasefire for that, right? We're going to continue, right? Don't expect anytime soon that Russia is just going to stop on the battlefield. And I have very much doubts. I've already listed most of the explicit goals, if not all of them, of Russia's special military operation and how it hasn't backed away from them. There's no way that the West can accept Kherson and Zaporozhye as part of Russia. And there's no way Russia cannot can give that up because it's in Russia's constitution. It's just not something that Putin can politically walk away from. And arguably, security-wise, they shouldn't either. And, the promises made to the people of Kherson and Zaporozhye. So what kind of agreement can there possibly be on that? Much less, also the Donbass and so forth. Yeah, maybe they'd be willing to give up Crimea, but the West would, but nothing more, right? And the issues of the size of the Ukrainian military, the issues of is the West allowed to continue to arm Ukraine? They keep pushing this European European NATO forces on the ground in Ukraine as a peacekeeping mission. Get out of here, right? First of all, that's a recipe for war. Because, of course, the Kiev regime will stage whatever is necessary to immediately start the conflict. And then what? The Western countries that have peacekeepers there at the least are at war with Russia. That's just absolutely absurd. And it has to be said that if you think, let's take the Trump, the trend that we want to believe that the Trump administration wants out of Ukraine, right? I believe they want out of Ukraine, but it's all about the terms, right? Let's say their terms, they're willing to give more in Russia's direction. Do not think that the EU is willing to accept this, the majority of the EU. Yes, Fitzo and Orban and possibly a handful of others, right? But they don't speak for Europe. We know that. And the entirety of the blob in the United States, right, that is still there. Obviously, they will be doing what they can to throw a spanner to sabotage anything that they view as any type of concession to Russia. And just be prepared for all types of false flags, crazy stuff. Russian intelligence is warning about a potential plot to stage some type of provocation in the Baltic Sea. The Baltic states have been up to all sorts there in the past weeks. They pulled out of the joint energy grid with Russia and Belarus, which means, of course, that their electricity prices immediately jumped up like crazy, ridiculously. Way to go there. Anyway, but they also ordered all their citizens to come back in case the borders close. And Russian intelligence is warning that Kiev and the Baltics are preparing to blow up some type of tanker ship or something and blame Russia for it. And there's been enough going on in the Baltics, enough cables now on both sides that have been broken or had just accidents happen to them. There's a lot of questions. There is already a shadow war going on in the Baltic Sea, almost definitely, and that could be escalated more. And just in the last 24 hours, suddenly out of nowhere, a drone suddenly flies into the Chernobyl nuclear containment shield, right, over the Chernobyl accident site, right? And according to the Kiev regime, did significant damage, although radiation levels are normal. And immediately, of course, it was Russia who did this. No one who is honest or sane or both, right, understands that this is just the beginning of potential false flag events, because Zelensky was already speaking how if the Kiev regime and Europe are not part of negotiations with the US and Russia, then that will bring another catastrophe to Europe. Little Freudian slip there. Here's your catastrophe, right? I believe this is a warning. Of course, this is a warning to the West that you're going to continue this war, and if not, we're going to create all sorts of problems, right? Everyone, none of them will admit that that's what happened, but everyone knows that the Kiev regime did this, and it's a threat. It's a pretty blatant threat, and it's the threat of a crazy man, right? Of a desperate insane, as even Time Magazine has previously called them, according to his own officials' anonymous words, delusional, right? Expect a lot more of this, both from forces in Europe, the deep state in the United States, from the Kiev regime. They're just not going to go down quietly with all of this. And even on the battlefield, right? Russia, by and large, continues. But if you've been paying close attention over the last 3 weeks, you will have become aware that the Kiev regime did launch counterattacks. I wouldn't call them an offensive. They weren't quite up that, but they did launch significant counterattacks, local counterattacks, in several different places along the front. They launched a major counterattack, including maybe 100, maybe more Western military vehicles for the most part in the Kursk region. And that was severely, obviously known it was coming, stamped down immediately. It was immediately crushed with crippling damage. And we have actually saw a significant amount of that from the drone footage, the FPV drone footage. They also tried counterattacks in Turetsk. That bought them maybe another week before that was also crushed. In Pokrovsk, in the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk, in Pashanya and a couple of other places, they did launch a counterattack and surged forward a hamlet or two, and in a crucial direction towards cutting off the supply lines to Pokrovsk. And there they have maybe bought themselves another couple of weeks. They were a little more successful there. I mean, it's all about buying time at this point. That there's not going to be any reversal anywhere on the battlefield. But expect another Hail Mary, a suicide offensive attempt, right? As things start, if things start pushing on the diplomatic front here in the coming weeks. Now, all during January, both sides were actually planning offensives. But again, if you were paying close attention, there was freak January weather, right, in Russia and Ukraine. Now, normally in this part of the world, winter, the dead of winter, is considered very good fighting weather, right? The ground is frozen and hard. Small rivers are also frozen. It's all passable, right? Vehicles can go off-road. They're not restricted to roads and the like, and it's good fighting weather. The bad fighting weather is in the wet autumn and spring, right? The Rasputitsa, the mud season, right? That's when things are bad. But this January, it was the warmest January in record, right? The temperature in Ukraine and in much of Russia, European Russia, okay, not in Siberia and Yakutia and everything, but in European Russia, was above freezing for most of January. It was a mud season in what should be the middle of winter. And that foiled offensive plans on both sides. I believe that the Kiev regime probably had more crazy suicidal offensives planned, but were unable to launch them because of the weather, probably in the direction of Zaporozhye, maybe some others as well. But likewise, Russia was, the fighting didn't stop, but there could be no big maneuver offensives launched that required vehicles going off-road, right? Which they do have to for a lot of things. Instead, fighting, doubled down in where they already had a foothold in existing urban areas and the like. But now the weather has, as of the second week of February, dropped definitively below zero again. The ground is firming up. And now suddenly expect the possibility of some more dramatic movements on the ground, some possible offensives from both sides. You might see a more dynamic battlefield here in the next month. Again, it's a very limited time window now until, presumably, until the spring kicks in. There's a month maybe, unless we have another freak event, and then as if nature to make up for spring in January drags winter into May. It's not unheard of, right? It could potentially happen, but again, weather is not 100% determinate. Oh, it's mud, we can't fight. I mean, that doesn't happen, but they do change plans. Things have to be taken into account. And when you consider, shall we say, lack of dramatic changing of ground or dramatic offensives over the last month, and you're like, oh, the Kiev regime is done, they don't have anything left in them. All right, they're done, but they're not done, right? And they still have the potential to pull some more Hail Mary suicide plays, out of their butt. I think they almost certainly will. And a lot of that has been, I believe, on hold because of the weather in January. And there's a lot of Russian military analysts who have said the same thing. So at least be prepared that there may be some more dramatic gestures on both sides in the coming month.
Yeah. Mark, I wanted to ask you about Europe in particular. Europe is in a big freakout mode right now because of what Trump has been saying, what JD Vance has been saying, what Pete Hegseth has been saying. The theme is Europe is going to spend more on their military. They're going to take care of Europe. And there's I think a comment that not many people are seeing, especially coming out of the mouths of people like JD Vance and Hegseth. They're not, a lot of people, especially Americans, I don't think are paying attention to how now they're saying, well, we're going to focus on the home front and the Indo-Pacific and China, because that is the biggest external threat. So do you see a lot of this chest thumping around Europe and kind of tightening the leash on Europe as a shift in U.S. foreign policy under Trump? Or is it more complicated than that?
It is a shift in U.S. Not just foreign policy. I would even say that Trump definitely has his own. I don't know if I would call it a grand strategy or a grand strategic vision, but it is maybe what might pass as a major change in that. If somehow he was able to continue it on past 4 years, maybe if JD Vance wins the next election and continues on with the Trump policy. So it has to be said, the Europeans are furious. They're refusing to accept this. They are making all sorts of rhetorical statements about doubling down on military spending that they have not been able to do during this entire conflict. And they can drag this out a little longer, but they cannot make up for a lack of U.S. weapons if Trump actually stops the flow of U.S. weapons into Ukraine, which, it has to be said, has not happened yet, right? That has not been done. There haven't been any new requests of money from Congress, and I don't, at least at the moment, certainly don't see the Trump administration doing that, nor have there been any new tranches of weapons sent by the Trump administration to Ukraine. Now, supposedly, there's still somewhere between 3 and 4 billion allocated to the Kiev regime that Biden wasn't able to spend before he got out of office. But they did send a lot of weapons and ammunition in those last couple of months. So they may be sitting fine, at least until the summer, but we'll see. Europe can't make up for that if the Trump administration doesn't indeed stop. And again, even with the U.S. doing everything they could under the Biden administration, it still wasn't enough to stop Russia, right? That has to be. Russia was already winning when Biden was providing everything he could from U.S. inventories and production and everything. Russia was still winning, but of course it means that they will end it faster if the U.S. really does get out of arms. And just in the past week, right, last weekend, Denmark sent more F-16s to the Kiev regime, and France sent French Mirage 2000s to the Kiev regime. So quite obviously, they're not done yet. Now, I don't expect this. I expect the efficacy on the battlefield of these new F-16s, we don't know exactly how many, and the Mirages to be about as effective as the F-16s have been thus far for the Kiev regime, which is to say no effectiveness whatsoever. But it is certainly a gesture. Now, keep in mind that the Mirage 2000s were already junk. They were already being decommissioned, and that's why they were sent. Likewise, these F-16s are all going to be decommissioned as well. And Denmark got a sweetheart deal on the F-35, which, considering it's the F-35, I don't consider that maybe the word sweetheart deal it could ever be appropriate. Boondoggle, maybe. But regardless, it's a clear indication that even if they can't significantly kick up military production to even try to make up for the United States, it doesn't mean that they have had themselves in a mental space yet where they're ready to give up the game. They're definitely not in that mental space yet. And it may take a few more months. It may take the rest of the year. It may take Russian troops moving on the Dnieper and Kharkov and Kiev to do it. I don't know what will make them give up the game completely. But at the end of the day, as long as the Kiev regime can keep conscripting people and they keep fighting to one degree or another, we all know the problems they're facing with desertion and morale and the failure of their conscription programs. But there are still people fighting. They are still making counterattacks, some of which even have some limited, if temporary, success. They're hurting, right? They are crumbling in places, but they are not broken yet. And it may take a while for that. Just keep all of that in mind. Don't expect magic overnight, either on the military front or on the diplomatic front. Be patient. Be confident in the course and the pace that the Russian government has set with these things. None of us have been happy with it, right? We've all been frustrated. We all wanted over 6 months ago, right? We all wanted it done with. We want to see this, or we want, some payback. We want some revenge. It's on an emotional level. It is frustrating. And I hear you. And I know that I'm one of those who've been saying it's not over yet. Don't jump to conclusions. It's not going to be over in 2 months. It's not going to be over in 2 months. I know there's lots of people that have been saying from the beginning of this conflict, it'll all be over in 2 months and Russia's going to crush them and it'll all be over. I have not been one of those people. I'm sure you're well familiar with that. And that doesn't mean that I don't think that Russia is going to win this. I just think it's still going to be long and hard and bloody yet, potentially. Right? We could see some dramatic developments, right? One of the caveats that I have made a long time ago is the one thing that could seriously alter events on the battlefield is if there is regime change in the US, in Kiev, or in Russia. Well, we've just seen regime change in the United States. And this regime change is a real regime change, right? It is not just a trading of one hegemonic figurehead for another. Trump has different views, right? What I believe Trump's grand strategic vision or foreign policy is, if you want to use those words. I'm not so sure that it's not that well thought out, but some people make the argument. He takes a look at the pursuit of global US-led Western global hegemony over the last few decades. And I believe that he thinks it is wasteful, that it has not delivered the results, and that it is costing the US too much in financial terms, in military terms, and political capital, and it is not bringing them enough benefits in response. And certainly with Russia and China, and you could argue Iran and other countries continuing to rise, that's direct evidence against that, or in favor of Trump's argument. So I believe Trump is not some benevolent guy who wants to suddenly reassess all of this and find a constructive place for the United States as one great power among any in a multipolar world, trying trade and no. Trump's vision is a return to old school imperialism among great powers, where the first thing he retrenches in the Western Hemisphere and says, this is ours, right? Forget, the Monroe Doctrine. We can call it the Don Roe Doctrine, right? That's this noise about Greenland and Canada and Panama and so forth. He obviously intends to knuckle down and retrench in the Western Hemisphere. And yes, he doesn't care about, I believe he doesn't really care about Europe. What's more is he doesn't like European leaders, right? And you can certainly include Zelensky. Not that I consider him a European leader, but in that as well. He doesn't like them. He has contempt for them, right? And remember, a lot of this European political elite openly backed Democrats in the United States. First Joe Biden, or first Hillary Clinton, and then Joe Biden, and then they were willing to back Kamala Harris. They were opposed to Trump, and Trump remembers all of this. He despises the Western European, political elite. He really has contempt for them. That's why he has no problem with the idea of the U.S. walking away from Europe. The Europeans are rich countries. They should pay for their own defense. If they want to fight a war with Russia, they can fight the war with Russia. We would like to de-escalate our way out of that and leave it to the Europeans. Whatever they decide to do with it, right, is there, he doesn't, obviously he has opinions on, but he doesn't care about so much. But it's going to be very tricky for him, both because of the net of alliances and pressure and leverage and the domestic political structure, the blob in the United States and so forth, to just walk away from Ukraine. He can't just walk away from it. So he's trying to negotiate his way out of it while saving face for himself and the United States. And the Europeans and Kiev are not going to make that easy for him, and neither is Russia, because Russia's not willing to make those concessions that will allow him to save face. And yes, he obviously sees the U.S. big adversary as China in the Pacific. I mean, how many times have we heard it? You can practically hear the voice, China, 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 right? He's absolutely obsessed with this. And,
well, Vance and Hegseth, especially Hegseth, love to say the communist Chinese.
The Communist Party of China, right? You can practically hear it, right? The dictator Putin, right? The mullahs in Iran, the Chinese Communist Party, right? These are the blob's favorite dehumanizing caricatures of their enemies. And yes, you will not hear Trump say the dictator Putin. But for whatever reason, right? And trying to get inside Trump's head, I believe, is a lost cause. he obviously respects Putin. He like admires him, and who knows why he does. It's obvious. He believes strong men. He does not see Olaf Scholz or Macron or Keir Starmer as strong men, right? He doesn't. That's why he had more respect for Kim Jong-un than he did for any of the European leaders. Not because he necessarily liked North Korea, but he has a shall we say a strong man vision of leadership of the world, and there's something to be made for that. Will, at least. I may not agree with Trump on a lot of things, but he has will, and has a will to power that he can force his view on other people. That is undeniable, right? And at this point, right? It may not always work, right? One of the most valiant stands thus far has been the Egyptian leader, the president of Egypt, Sisi, who has refused to open the borders of Egypt to allow Israel to ethnically cleanse and drive the Palestinians out of it, so that Trump can cut a real estate deal and build his French Riviera in Gaza, where the Palestinians once lived. Right now, it has to be said that, first of all, the Biden administration had plans for this first, but Blinken couldn't push it through. Right, this was reported openly on the Western press. He tried to get the not just Egypt, but also the president of Jordan. And Trump is now doubling down and saying that he is going to convince them. He's going to use the leverage, the aid the U.S., which is significant, particularly to the Egyptian military that the U.S. provides. And the king of Jordan was obviously already waffling, right? Well, let's see what Egypt says. Right? I love that. But Sisi has refused, at least in the last 3 days or so, and I haven't seen anything to the contrary yet, he refused to come to Washington when invited. He said, if that's what you want to talk about, I'm not interested. I'm not coming. That's pretty impressive. Now, whether that can continue is another story. Egypt has a lot of domestic political and sociological problems and so forth, but that has been a valiant stand of will against Trump thus far. And ultimately, I think he probably does respect when someone stands up against him, even as he then tries to crush them. And but whether he can get Putin to agree to accept terms that are acceptable to the U.S. in Ukraine so that he can save face there and walk away, I don't see it. I don't see it. I think they will talk. I think that U.S.-Russian relations will improve. I think it is probably likely at the end of the day that the U.S. will try to de-escalate themselves from out of Ukraine, even as the conflict continues. And Trump tries to deflect the burden of that if the fight is going to go on to Europe, which is not capable in even the medium term of carrying that burden. But there's going to be a lot of obstruction, even obstruction within the Trump administration. If you believe that Rubio and Waltz and even Kellogg, who have all, certainly Waltz and Kellogg, have been openly written about in the Western press of arguing for a escalate to de-escalate position for Trump to force Russia to agree to the U.S. terms. Others almost certainly have that position within the Trump administration as well. Now, we know, for one, that Tulsi Gabbard does not. But we'll have to find out how that argument comes down within the Trump administration. I've said it before. I've said it on this show. I've said it other places. The crux moment is going to come when Trump tries to push his deal, his plan on Putin, and Putin says, I'm glad we're talking. It's good that we're talking, but thanks, but no thanks. We're just going to continue, right? We can't accept those terms, right? We'll just take it by force then. Then what does Trump do, right? And obviously, J.D. Vance is talking about U.S. troops in Ukraine if if Putin cannot negotiate in good faith. Now, again, we can argue whether he's serious about that or not, or whether it's a rhetorical bluff. I hope it's the latter. I have everything we've heard from the Trump administration thus far would tend to make me believe that it is rhetorical bluff, but it doesn't mean it should be discounted entirely, because a lot of things will just matter how things shake down. I don't mean to rain on any parades. There's been enough things that I have been excited and encouraged about happening in the last couple of weeks. But I'm just watch the hopium. That's all I'm saying. Indulge moderately in hope.
Well, I wanted to ask you, Mark, perhaps in our final kind of last hurrah here, I wanted to ask you about this overall. You mentioned Trump's grand strategy. I'm kind of noticing something. We've seen Donald Trump say Russia could be back into a G8 kind of scenario, into the G7. He said, we want to denuclearize with Russia. We want to cut these nuclear weapons down to size. There's too many of them. Also seen, I'm going to talk to Russia and China, and we're all going to, each one of us, not just China and Russia, but each one of us, cut military spending by 50%. Now, when it comes to Russia, as we've discussed, there is this obvious shift away, where there's an attempt to shift away from a kind of a Russia-focused foreign policy, perhaps more toward China and the Asia Pacific, and perhaps the Middle East, maybe, and elsewhere. But I'm curious if you believe that one of Trump's strategies, if we can call it that here, is to try to break away Russia. This is not a new thing, not a new attempt, but try to break away Russia from, he said BRICS is dead, right? Why would anyone want to be in BRICS? So there's all kinds of, there's all kinds of little hints of,
and it's the Gulf of America too, right? Because I say so, right? Okay. So first of all, with regards to nuclear agreements, obviously at some point, I don't know if it will be in the next 4 years, but the major nuclear powers have got to sit down and hash out some type of new successor, probably to New START. Probably not just between the US and Russia, but between also China and other major nuclear, the UK, France, India, Pakistan, Israel, even North Korea now, right? There has to be some type of agreement, at least among the majority of those nuclear powers. And it will have to probably address, if, maybe it's too expansive, but things like hypersonic weapons and AI and underwater nuclear drones and a lot of these other things have got to be considered as well in a successor to the Cold War security architecture. That should be done. Now, do I believe that either Russia or the United States are going to cut down anywhere in the near future on their number of nuclear weapons? No, not at all. That's not realistic. I don't think the Russians are willing to do that. They very much rely on their nuclear deterrent. They may not be interested in a quantitative arms race where, with New START gone, they start building large numbers of new nuclear weapons. I think they're happy with the number they have. But there's obviously a qualitative new arms race, right? Where older weapons are replaced with new, more modern, more powerful, more accurate, faster, right? Hypersonic, Oreshnik, all of these things, right? There is a new arms race that has been going on since the U.S. pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty back in 2003, but it is becoming very visible now. So there will have to be some type, whether that comes during Trump's administration or not, I don't know. That's a big deal. That will be a big, huge world-shaping effort. I do believe that Trump, all things given, that his first instinct is to try to, for the U.S. to get its way with economic. And obviously he has this fixation with tariffs. It goes back to he fixates on the period of William McKinley's presidency, right, at the very beginning of the 19th century, the end of the 18th century, as the golden age of America. And he sees tariffs as the tool to get there. And he would like to deal with China and Iran and other countries with tariffs. He's somehow fixated on that. But when that doesn't work, right, I don't believe that Trump is adverse to using military and other force to get the U.S. way. I mean, he did assassinate Qasem Soleimani and several Iraqi generals. Right? Let's remember that. Something that was, if the Iranian government didn't have the level of restraint that they do, would, it can certainly be considered an act of war. Right. So, don't believe too much in the Trump peacemaker thing, even if he would at first instinct try to avoid major conflict. He certainly wouldn't shy away from it if he believed it was necessary for American interests either. And, obviously China is what he's focusing on in that regard. Why does he want to move U.S. troops and equipment out of Europe? Because he wants to move them to the Pacific, right? And you can say, oh, that's just to contain China. Well, everything is to contain China until China doesn't want to be contained. And there we go. Russia did not want to be contained right up with NATO, right up against their border either, and neither does China. And this whole issue of Taiwan is a whole nother story. And Trump hasn't made his exact opinions of Taiwan. He said some interesting things. But that is something that has yet to be determined. But obviously he does want to focus on China and the Pacific in whatever way. Do not expect military spending in the U.S. or Russia to go down significantly. If the conflict in Ukraine somehow miraculously is brought to an end, expect Russian military spending to decline, perhaps even to halve, back down to 4 or 5% of the economy, but don't expect it to shrink the size of the Russian or the U.S. military by half. That's not going to happen. That's not within Russia's interests, right? Russia has just built up this powerful, experienced, modern, conventional military that is a peer adversary, if not stronger in some ways than the U.S.'s military. They're not just going to give that up, nor should they. Keep in mind, whatever Trump does or doesn't do in the next 4 years, Trump is gone in 4 years, right? Unless he declares himself God Emperor. Then Russia will have to deal with the next U.S. president, which is one of the reasons why Putin is, whatever Trump may believe or want, Russia needs to keep in mind that the next U.S. president could reverse everything that Trump has done, just like Trump is trying to reverse everything that Joe Biden did, right? And that is just something that all countries increasingly will have to take into account with the United States whenever there is an exchange of power, that it could bring dramatic domestic and now even potentially international policy differences.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's why I wanted to ask this question, Mark, because we've seen over the years, while the United States has definitely been opening up all of the fronts and getting
Yes.
bogged down everywhere, we've seen certain elements of, especially the neocons, talk about, well, how can we pull away Russia and China from each
Yeah.
other? And it
Yeah.
seems to me,
Trump and a lot of the MAGA people obviously at some level have that in the back of their heads. Oh, we can bring Putin against China. Right? Fantasize all you want. It is never going to happen, right? The leaders of China and the Soviet Union made that mistake in the Cold War. And if you want to take a look at any single one factor, looking at one factor would be a mistake, but probably the single biggest factor to the U.S. winning the Cold War, if you want to say that, was them exploiting the Sino-Soviet split. And the Russian and Chinese leaders of today are well aware of that. They're well aware of the strength they have together. They're very comfortable working with each other and having each other's back. While, you know, the plan, of course, was for Russia to deal with Europe as both a business partner and a competitor, and for China to deal with the U.S. as a business, as a competitor and as a business partner. Frenemies, if you want to call it that way. But, the whole Ukraine thing happened, and that kind of, had those plans. But Russia and China complement each other. They're very comfortable working together. Both leaderships have strong, long-term strategic visions for their country. And whatever Putin may say, and whatever, he is never going to give that up. Let's be honest. Putin knows how to play Trump, right? Every leader in the world tries to play Trump, right? They know his ego. They know he's susceptible to flattery, right? And that he does all politics as if, he's doing a selfie stream, right, with a megaphone on, and to the American and to some extent the global audience. And they may say things at various times that play to Trump's ego, and Putin certainly will as well. But don't doubt that every time they do that, that Russia and China aren't then getting together and exchanging notes, right? And this is what we said to him, and this is how he responded, and blah, blah, blah. That is happening at a level and a frequency that people in the West, that the West's geopolitical experts severely underestimate.
well, I remember, Mark, when Donald Trump reached out to Xi Jinping right at the beginning of his administration. What happened directly afterward was that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping had a conversation. I don't even know if it was 24 hours after that conversation, but it was directly after. So there's absolutely no doubt that's happening. And
hey, be prepared for Trump to try to renew his bromance with Kim Jong-un and to pull Kim Jong-un away from Putin as well. That's not likely to happen either. But
and
they may
saying,
all slap each other in the back in a summit at some point.
Yeah, and here's what Wang Yi had to say to questions at the Munich Security Conference that definitely back up what you've just been saying about this relationship.
Country, and based on our mutual trust, we built a comprehensive strategic partnership. So exchanges between China and Russia are normal exchanges between countries. You mentioned, can China stop buying gas from Russia? Well, I'd like to ask this. If China does not buy gas from Russia, which country can provide so much gas as to meet the needs of Chinese people? It's not possible.
So I don't think we're going to see the United States pump its fracked gas.
That's really important what he just said there. Russia and Chinese leadership trust each other. That has built up over the last 2-3 decades. Neither the U.S. nor the Chinese leader trust the U.S. leadership or the European leadership, and they have both complained about it endlessly, right? And that is, people may really underestimate. Again, don't be surprised if Putin plays Trump a bit. If Trump really pushes the, oh, you can side with us against China, and Putin says, yeah, sure we are, right? You know, be prepared for a little bit of that rhetorically, but don't ever doubt that Russia and China aren't then exchanging notes behind Trump's back whenever that happens, because it is absolutely happening. And if there's one thing that I am absolutely confident about, right? I'm not 100% confident in the Russian-Indian relationship. You know, it's a good relationship. I'm not 100%. I'm not 100% confident in, you know, in any other relationships, but or even the Russian-Iranian relationship, which is a very good relationship and getting better. The Russian-Chinese relationship is the bedrock pillar of resistance to the United States, be that against U.S.-led Western hegemony or some renewed type of U.S. empire under Trump, right? It is that pillar. It is not only the pillar, the foundation of resistance to the United States, but ultimately the pillar, the bedrock foundation of a multipolar world is the bilateral relationship between China and Russia. Everything else, there's a whole house to build, but it must be built on that foundation. And that is one thing I have no doubt about.
Yeah, and this comes to the question then of, well, what does the United States offer here? You talked a lot about negotiations between Russia and the United States potentially coming to a big rut, possibly because of the lack of
Russia doesn't want back in the G8. Russia doesn't. This is Trump's latest.
Like, what are they going to offer? Like,
Russia's been clear about that many times. The U.S., the G8 was already a useless talking shop, and Russia has said multiple times before they're not interested in rejoining that, right? They've got the G20. They've got BRICS, right? Why would they want the G8? They don't want the G8. It's not a reward, right? It's not a, oh, you can give up Zaporozhye. Sure, if we give you the G8, right? No, that's not going to happen. Also, one thing you don't hear Russia talking about in the context of a Ukraine settlement, at least, you know, it's not a priority, is sanctions. It's not a priority for Russia. It's not. They've adjusted. The Russian economy is growing. Now, doubtless new, revenue would increase in some ways, but there are lots of arguments to be made that, at least in part, the growth in the Russian economy that Russia is experiencing is not despite Western sanctions. It is because of them. So sanctions, again, sanctions relief would be welcome, I think, not by everyone in Russia, right? There are a lot of people who are making a lot of money off of those sanctions being in place as they've replaced Western companies and the like with domestic production and so forth, right? But Russia is not willing to sacrifice its geopolitical interests in Ukraine or its humanitarian interests in Ukraine for sanctions relief. It has endured these sanctions as a result of its interventions, and it is not going to give up the goals of the interventions for sanctions relief. Even for, first of all, it doesn't believe that the West can just reverse sanctions, because Jackson Vanik took decades after the dissolution of the Soviet Union to be removed. But regardless, it is not a priority because Russia is doing okay with the sanctions in place, right? With more than 24,000 sanctions in place, and Russia's stronger than ever and more independent, and putting themselves back into a position where that can be used as leverage over them. Do we really want or need back in SWIFT? It's not a priority. Right? It's not the first thing. The West thinks that they're somehow going to use that. We'll allow you to reopen Nord Stream if you give up in Ukraine. Get out of here. Just get out of here. It's not going to happen.
Well, I was going to say, Mark, that not even with all of the hope that people are putting into the Trump administration and its early talks with Russia, they're not offering sanctions relief openly,
No.
or and likely not even in closed doors, because openly they've said Pete Hegseth said it right before Munich started. He said, well, we could use sanctions to strengthen
Yeah.
and force Russia to the table. And this is something that almost everybody from Trump, Hegseth,
Well, if the first 24,000 sanctions we didn't do it, the next 500 will surely do it, right? I mean,
right, like, and then they say more effective enforcement. I don't need, what does that even mean, Mark? I don't need more effective enforcement.
It's clear what that means, right? Because there's nothing else they can say. The U.S. and Russia actually have very limited economic exposure, right? Uranium and other things that the U.S. actually needs. When they use those words, tightening sanctions, what they really mean is sanctioning the rest of the world into obeying Western sanctions on Russia, so-called secondary sanctions, right? And that's what they're talking about. They're talking about sanctioning Chinese companies and Indian companies and China and Indian banks and the countries as a whole to try to force them to stop trading with Russia. That's what they're talking about when they talk. If you take a look at the last rounds of sanctions, the majority of them have all been sanctions. Secondary sanctions going after companies in Turkey and the UAE and elsewhere to try to, by diktat, force the rest of the world to stop trading with Russia. It hasn't worked very well for them so far, because at the end of the day, they don't want to be dictated who they can't and can't trade with. And in a world of finite resources that everyone needs, like oil and gas and grain and metals and chemicals and other things, that Russia is the biggest supplier of the global market to, they inevitably take a look at those sanctions and then just ignore them and try to find ways to go around them, right? Because they're always written to an exact legal degree, and then there's a workaround. And inevitably, that's what they do. They don't challenge them directly, right? They just ignore them and go around them. And that is what will happen going forward as well. India just signed a huge long-term oil supply contract with Russia. They're interested in big LNG sales as well. We know Russia and China are constantly in negotiations to open the Power of Siberia 2 and other pipelines and LNG. That is, they can't force China and India and Turkey and other countries to stop trading with Russia. They can't. They may try, but they haven't succeeded in the last 3 years, and they're not going to in the next 4.
No, no, they are not, Mark. I agree with you there. Well, I think we can conclude here. Everybody, it's been a great show. Happy Valentine's Day. Be sure when you leave, you hit the like button, because that will keep the stream boosted. Be sure to go to the video description where you can find all the ways to support this work here on the channel, from Patreon, Substack, and much more. We have a big week starting next week on live stream, so be sure to be on the lookout for those notices. But have a great weekend, everybody, and we will be departing now. Mark, any parting words?
Let's all get some sleep.
yeah. It is late out there in Russia, Mark. All right. Well, take care, everyone. Good night.